The dust seemed to precede them, a fine, cruel powder kicked up by the weary hooves of a horse that moved with the stiff, precise gait of something long accustomed to the weight of conflict, not distance. Eleanor rode him like she lived, lean and silent, her eyes fixed on the distant, improbable sight. A house that stood against the vast, indifferent sky, too large, too solid for this desolate stretch of land. Her clothes, once respectable, were now little more than faded rags clinging to a frame that hunger had sculpted into sharp angles. Every muscle ached, a dull, constant throb that mirrored the hollow ache in her chest. They had been moving for weeks, days blurring into a monotonous cycle of thirst, exhaustion, and the gnawing fear of what lay behind, and perhaps worse, what lay ahead. This house, this sprawling ranch that rumors painted with the color of excess in a world bleached of hope, was their last chance. Or perhaps their last ditch. Her hand, calloused and scarred, rested lightly on the horse's neck, feeling the familiar ripple of muscle beneath the sweat-stained hide. Veteran, her anchor, her protector, a creature of war now navigating a peace that felt just as dangerous. He was a marvel, bred for courage and endurance, a true war horse, out of place in this quiet, empty landscape, much like herself. People looked at him, then at her, with a mix of awe and suspicion. They saw the horse's power, the faded brands of military service, and they saw her, a woman alone, weathered and wary, and they drew conclusions she couldn't afford to correct. They reached the gate, grand and wrought iron, a stark contrast to the humble fences she was used to. The house loomed, 2 stories of solid wood and stone, surrounded by outbuildings, corrals, and the distant glint of water, a reservoir, a lifeline in this parched world. A world away from the muddy, bloody fields where she and Veteran had earned their scars. She dismounted, her knees protesting, and led Veteran forward, the dust settling on his dark coat like a shroud. He lowered his head, blowing softly, sensing the shift in the air, the possibility, however slim. She approached the wide porch, her footsteps echoing faintly. The silence of wealth was different from the silence of the plains. It felt heavy, expectant. She swallowed, her throat dry. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was the currency here. She raised a hand, hesitant to knock. The door opened before she touched it. A man stood there, not a hired hand, not a servant. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The ragged woman, the powerful horse, the desperation she tried to mask. He wasn't wearing a suit of city wealth, but practical, well-made ranch clothes. He looked capable, weathered, his face lined, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that spoke of command, of a mind that calculated and assessed. He didn't smile. "Yes?" he asked, his voice deep, quiet, holding a note of impatience. It was not unkind, but it was certainly not welcoming. The moment stretched, thick with the weight of her need and his silent judgment. She took a breath, straightened her thin shoulders, and met his gaze directly. "You're Silas Blackwood?" she asked, her voice raspy but steady. "I heard you needed a housekeeper." The lie felt brittle, thin as her worn soul. She knew nothing of keeping a house. She knew horses, maps, strategies, and the brutal art of staying alive. Silas Blackwood studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands, then shifting to the magnificent, battle-scarred horse standing patiently beside her. He noted the way she held herself, weary but not broken, the directness of her gaze that contradicted the tattered state of her appearance. He was a man who read the land, the sky, and the creatures that inhabited them. People were often harder to decipher, but this woman and her horse presented a riddle that piqued something beyond mere curiosity. "I did," he finally said, his voice slow, measured. "But that was weeks ago." The position was filled. He watched for her reaction. The flicker of despair in her eyes was brief, quickly masked. He saw the slight tightening of her jaw, the subtle shift in her weight as if preparing to turn and face the long, empty road again. His reputation, he knew, was formidable, a man who had clawed his fortune from this unforgiving land, ruthless in business, solitary by nature. People rarely approached his door unless they had purpose or desperate need. Her need was evident, but her purpose, claiming to be a housekeeper, felt incomplete. "I see," she replied, her voice quieter now, defeat touching the edges. She didn't plead, didn't beg. That, he noted, was uncommon. "I apologize for the imposition, Mr. Blackwood." She began to gather the reins, preparing to leave. "Hold on," he said, stepping forward slightly. "You came a long way by the look of you. And your horse," he gestured towards Veteran with a slight tilt of his head. "That's no ordinary mount." He walked down a step, his eyes knowledgeable as he assessed the animal. "Military?" Eleanor hesitated, a flicker of caution in her eyes. This was dangerous ground. "He served," she confirmed, her voice low. "With distinction." "And you?" Silas asked, looking back at her. Her eyes, he saw now, held a depth of experience that no amount of dirt and fatigue could hide. There was knowledge in them and loss. "I was with him," she answered evasively. He didn't press. Curiosity warred with a lifetime of self-sufficiency and a wariness of strangers. But there was something about her, about the pair of them, that felt resilient, almost necessary. The housekeeper he'd hired hadn't lasted a week, complaining about the isolation, the dust, the sheer scale of the work. He needed someone capable, quiet, who wouldn't be frightened off by solitude or hard labor. This woman looked like she'd faced harder things than a little dust. "Housekeeping here is more than just sweeping," he stated. "It's cooking, laundry, keeping things running in a house built to hold more people than just one. It's isolated. No neighbors for miles. Hard work from sunup to sundown. And frankly," he looked her up and down again, though not unkindly, "you don't look like you've scrubbed a floor in your life." A faint, almost imperceptible wince crossed her face. She knew he was right. Her skills lay in organization, logistics, resource management in chaotic environments. But she had watched others, learned quickly. "I learn fast," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Blackwood, and isolation. I prefer it." He considered her words, her demeanor, the raw honesty, despite the flimsy pretense of being a housekeeper, the quiet strength. He needed someone. She needed refuge. It wasn't the arrangement he'd envisioned, but this land often dictated unexpected terms. "All right," he said, surprising himself slightly. "I'll give you a trial. 1 week. If you can't handle it, you move on. If you can, we talk terms. The work is hard, the pay fair. And the horse. He stays here. He looks like he needs rest." Relief washed over her, sudden and intense, making her knees feel weak. She gripped Veteran's reins tighter, grounding herself. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she managed, the words thick with emotion she quickly suppressed. "I accept your terms," he simply nodded, turning to lead the way inside. "Come in then. My name is Silas. The stable is out back. See to your horse, then I'll show you the house and the work." As she followed him, leading Veteran around the house towards the sprawling barns, Eleanor felt a fragile thread of hope begin to weave itself into the tightly wound ball of her fear. It was a precarious hold, dependent entirely on the will of this taciturn, observant man, but it was a hold nonetheless. Life at the Blackwood Ranch settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the endless demands of the land. Eleanor, or Elle as Silas eventually called her, proved surprisingly adept at the tasks required. Her previous life had instilled in her a rigorous discipline, an eye for detail, and a capacity for sustained effort that served her well in managing the large household. She learned to coax flavor from simple ingredients, to make the vast rooms feel less empty, to keep the dust at bay, a never-ending battle. The work was physically demanding. Her hands grew tougher, her muscles leaner, but the exhaustion was clean, unlike the soul-deep weariness of her past. She spoke little and Silas spoke less. Their communication was often through gestures, quiet instructions, the shared understanding of tasks that needed doing. He was a constant, quiet presence, overseeing his ranch with the same watchful intensity, He had used to study her and Veteran that first day. He wasn't cold, precisely, but reserved. A man who had clearly built walls around himself as high and strong as the mountains that ringed his property. Yet she noticed the small things. The way he ensured she had enough firewood for the stove, the quality of the provisions he brought back from his infrequent trips to the distant town, the quiet permission for Veteran to graze in the best pasture, a privilege he didn't extend lightly. Veteran, for his part, thrived. The open spaces, the fresh water, the lack of constant threat allowed him to shed the tension that had held him for so long. He still moved with a soldier's discipline when asked, but often she would find him simply standing in the sun, head low, utterly relaxed. He remained her shadow, her silent companion, and Silas seemed to understand their bond without needing explanation. He never asked about her past, about the military brands on Veteran, about the skills she occasionally revealed, a knowledge of terrain, an ability to tie knots with surprising strength, a quiet vigilance that never seemed to entirely leave her eyes. He simply accepted her, and the horse, into the fabric of his solitary life. The isolation was profound, a silence broken only by the wind, the cattle, and the creaks of the old house. For Elle it was a balm, a chance to heal away from the judging eyes of the world, a world that had no place for a woman with her history. But isolation could also breed unease. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and orange, a rider approached the ranch. It wasn't Silas returning. Elle, outside by the stables with Veteran, felt the familiar prickle of alarm she hadn't felt since she'd left her old life behind. The rider was too fast, too direct, arriving without the customary hail. Silas emerged from the house, rifle held loosely in his hand, his posture shifting instantly from relaxed homeowner to coiled protector. Elle moved instinctively towards Veteran, her hand going to a hidden pocket where she kept a small, heavy object she had never intended to use again. The rider pulled up hard, dust swirling. He was a rough-looking man, his face hard, his eyes shifting. "Silas Blackwood?" he called out, his voice loud, aggressive. "Heard you had a new hand. A woman. With a horse. A big dark horse," he spat in the dust. "Heard she might be the one we're lookin'." For Elle felt a cold knot form in her stomach. They had found her, or someone like her. The world she had fled was catching up. Silas didn't lower his rifle. His gaze was steady, hard. "Who's asking?" he demanded, his voice low, dangerous. The rough rider smirked, eyes fixed on Elle and Veteran. "Just lookin' for something that belongs to someone else." Heard she fit the description, he glanced towards Veteran, a predatory gleam in his eye. "That horse looks like a piece of military property gone astray. And the woman, well, there's folks who pay good money for information on certain folks who disappear." He didn't name names, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Elle's hand tightened around the object in her pocket. Veteran shifted restlessly beside her, sensing the tension. His ears pricked forward. Silas stepped slightly in front of Elle, subtly shielding her. His rifle didn't waver. "You heard wrong," Silas stated flatly. "She's my housekeeper. Been here for months. And that horse is mine. Bought him fair and square." It was a lie, a clear, unhesitating lie spoken with the authority of a man who was not to be challenged on his own land. The rider squinted, his gaze flicking between Silas, Elle, and the horse. He seemed uncertain, perhaps intimidated by Silas's calm, dangerous demeanor and the formidable presence of Veteran. "Ain't seen her in town," the rider pressed, though less aggressively now. "Don't get into town much," Silas replied easily. "Too much work here. Now, state your business or get off my land." The standoff stretched, the silence broken only by the wind and Veteran's soft snort. The rider seemed to weigh the potential reward against the risk of pushing a man like Silas Blackwood. Finally, with a frustrated curse, he reined his horse around. "All right, Blackwood, just checkin'. But if I hear different, or if I see that horse again, you won't." Silas cut in, his voice final. The rider didn't reply, simply spurred his horse and rode off the way he came, disappearing into the twilight. Elle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hand still clenched the weight in her pocket. She looked at Silas, standing there, rifle still aimed at the retreating figure until he was out of sight. He hadn't asked, hadn't hesitated. He had simply claimed her and Veteran as his own, offering a protection he wasn't obligated to give. When the rider was gone, Silas lowered the rifle. He didn't turn to her immediately. He just stood there for a moment, looking out at the empty land. "They won't be back," he said finally, his voice back to its usual quiet tone, but with an undertone of iron. "Not tonight, anyway. And they'll think twice about trying again." He turned then, his gaze meeting hers. There was no demand for an explanation. No questions about who they were or why they might be looking for her. There was just a quiet acknowledgement of the shared moment, the unspoken threat, and the unexpected defense. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to do that," he shrugged slightly. "Needed a housekeeper," he said, a hint of something that might have been a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Don't want to have to find another." It was dismissive, practical. But she heard the deeper meaning beneath the surface, a quiet acceptance, a choice to shelter her without needing to understand the storm she carried. She had arrived, ragged and running, offering a skill she barely possessed, accompanied by a war horse she couldn't explain. He had taken them in, given them refuge, and now offered protection against the shadows of her past. She looked at Veteran, then back at Silas. She had come seeking survival, a place to simply exist. She had found, in this desolate land and this solitary man, something she hadn't dared hope for. A quiet, sturdy sense of belonging. A place where she could perhaps, finally, stop running and simply be. Resilience wasn't just about enduring. It was about finding strength in unexpected places, forging connections in the most unlikely circumstances. She had come seeking a job, a roof over her head. She had found, here in the vast silence, a quiet partnership built on unspoken trust, shared hardship, and the simple, profound act of standing together against the coming storm. The war horse nuzzled her shoulder, a warm, solid presence. She leaned into him, then looked at Silas, the man who had offered refuge to a stranger and her war horse. The future was still uncertain, the past still a shadow, but for the first time in a long time, she faced it not with despair, but with a quiet, resilient hope.